Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the fifth segment of this year's virtual Choosing to Lead conference. My name is Megan DeRogers, and I'm President and CEO at 100 Miles. Whether you've been watching these sessions live every Tuesday or tuning into the recordings, we hope you have enjoyed our sessions to date, and I know you will love tonight's conversation. 100 Miles is a nonprofit organization located in coastal Georgia with a mission of preserving and protecting Georgia's 100-mile coast through advocacy, education, and citizen engagement. We have had 4 amazing sessions so far, and tonight promises to be super interesting and inspiring. Before we dive into the content, I want to acknowledge that none of these conversations would have been possible without the support of our generous sponsors. Thank you, Southern Ionics Minerals, Rayonier Advanced Materials, Cumberland Island Conservancy, and our many nonprofit partners for making our 2021 conference possible. We encourage all of our participants to visit our virtual exhibit hall, where you can learn more about our sponsors and their work. More than 500 people have registered for tonight's session, and many of you are joining us from all over the country and even internationally. So before we dive in with our speakers, I want to take a quick minute to acknowledge the work and conservation legacy that brings us here tonight. Georgia's coast is an ecological wonder of the world because of our extraordinary natural resources and because of the efforts that have been undertaken to protect them. This legacy of stewardship, volunteerism, and advocacy on and for our coast is what makes it so special today, and the efforts have been significant. For example, Georgia's coast is home to the oldest sea turtle conservation program in the nation. Today, the Georgia Sea Turtle Cooperative is a network of more than 200 volunteers and staff who monitor the beaches on 19 islands during nesting season to improve nesting success and the health of loggerhead sea turtles. This program started more than 55 years ago when sea turtle populations were in a sharp decline. And today we are seeing record numbers of nests laid and eggs hatched. Another example of a successful effort to protect an important coastal resource is the passage of the Coastal Marshlands Protection Act in 1970. In response to an attempt to mine 72,000 acres of salt marsh near Little Tybee Island for phosphate, citizens all across the state rose up and advocated for the state legislature to stop the mine and protect our marsh. In response, legislators passed a law that became the most protective salt marsh law on the East Coast. And today, our 400,000-acre salt marsh defines the coastal landscape. And finally, the last example I'll give is one of stewardship. Our coast is relatively rural. Approximately 50% of the land in the first-tier coastal counties is still in forest cover. We have 14 barrier islands and 9 are permanently protected, either through a conservation easement or because landowners sold or donated the islands to the state or federal government for the benefit of the public. Zooming out to the 11-county coastal region, there are more than 800,000 acres of land in conservation, much of it publicly accessible, owned by the state or the federal government. This reality is the result of thoughtful landowners and others who love this place and voluntarily made donations and investments toward its conservation. Y'all are participants in Choosing to Lead because you are also part of this legacy of citizen action to protect our coast. Our series culminates this evening with a discussion about individual action. Our speakers will discuss the question, how can we make a difference? Using the life of President Jimmy Carter as a case study of one individual who is doing the most he can with the one life he has. He is a remarkable example that we hope will inspire you. Tonight, we are lucky to have President Carter's oldest grandson, Jason Carter, as a moderator. For those of you who have been in Georgia for a while, you'll remember that Jason served as a state senator for 5 years and ran for governor in 2014. He is an attorney in Atlanta and serves as the chairman of the board of the Carter Center. Jason will be leading a conversation with 2 men who are deeply familiar with President Carter's life and service. Gus Speth is one of the fathers of our modern environmental movement. He helped found many groundbreaking environmental organizations, including the Natural Resources Defense Council and the World Resources Institute. And from 1977 to 1981, he served as President Carter's chairman on the Council on Environmental Quality. In this role, he was a principal advisor on matters affecting the environment and had overall responsibility for developing and coordinating the president's environmental program. Jonathan Alter is an award-winning author, political analyst, documentary filmmaker, columnist, television producer, and radio host. Jonathan is the author of 3 New York Times bestsellers, all about former American presidents, and his latest book, His Very Best, is the first full-length independent biography of President Carter. I'll mention that the cover of Jonathan's book is a portrait of President Carter that is hanging currently on St. Simon's Island at Musgrove, a retreat center that was used for the first pre-inaugural meeting of President Carter's cabinet in 1976. If you'd like to order Jonathan's book, you can find the link on the resource page for this session. These 3 men are going to talk about President Carter, but as you have heard, they are all impressive in their own rights, and we are lucky to have them with us tonight. These sessions are meant to be interactive, and this one will follow the trend. Jason will be watching the Q&A box and will do his best to thread your questions into their conversation. So I urge you to participate. Please add your questions to the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will answer as many as possible throughout the evening. Thank you for being here tonight. At this point, I'm going to turn the session over to our speakers. Thank you for supporting us over the last months of choosing to lead, and I hope you enjoy this session.
Thank you so much, Megan. I have long been an admirer of your organization and the work that it does on the Georgia coast, of course. It is my great honor to be here. My apologies for using such an old picture on my Zoom that I look much, much older and with a much fuller beard than you expected. These moments are important, and I'm excited to be here. And I also, it's 2021 now, but as we move forward, if you hear my dogs or my children, I'll apologize in advance as we move forward. Number one, it's great to be here with Jonathan and with Gus. I have been admirers of both of them for a long time, and I think we're in for a treat. Gus asked me before we began, as he was just saying, how's your grandfather doing? And so I thought I would start very briefly with an update on my grandparents and how they are, and then kick it over to Jonathan and Gus to really begin talking about the truly remarkable impact that my grandfather's presidency had and the rest of his life on Georgia in particular, but on the environmental movement more broadly, and then real concrete achievements that I think he is incredibly proud of. So with that, let me say that they're doing great. They are coming up, my grandparents, in July on their 75th wedding anniversary. Now, not very many people get to celebrate a 75th wedding anniversary. It means you have to be blessed in a huge number of ways, and they both feel that way for sure. They are in planes. They are, for the first time, I think, in their lives, the last couple of years, truly retired. The day-to-day work of the Carter Center and the Carter Center board is now being carried out at the center and with the Carter Center board. And they still call. My grandfather called me this morning, in fact, to tell me that he was concerned about some of the election laws being passed in Georgia and wanted to know what we were doing about it. So he is very active. He did have, as I was saying earlier, a bad fall about a year and a half ago now. That had caused some trauma to his brain, and he had to relearn a variety of things, including how to walk and talk. Some of that he has done. Some of that he's still limited in terms of mobility. So as I was saying to Gus and Jonathan earlier today, he's like the rest of us in that he sits at the house and yells at the TV now. But ultimately, one of the other impacts of this time in his life is that his eyesight is not as good as it was, and so he has some trouble reading. But what that has meant is that for the last several weeks, he has been listening to Jonathan Alter's book, His Very Best, on the Audible version that has a great reading. And so he has been enjoying that and living and being excited by the treatment that Mr. Alter has given to his life. And so what I thought I would do, given Jonathan's sort of very recent and very comprehensive assessment of Jimmy Carter and what he has done and meant, I thought I would kick it off to you, Jonathan, and knowing that this is a question about, or a panel about the environment, if you want to give just some sort of a topper, a brief sort of introduction, sort of Jimmy Carter as an environmentalist and what he's done, and then we'll ask Gus, who was intimately involved in the presidency, how he experienced those things. So with that, Jonathan, let's please give us a little bit of an introduction here.
Thanks, Jason, and thanks to everybody for joining this. I'm honored to be included tonight. So I argue that Jimmy Carter was the greatest conservationist president since Theodore Roosevelt, and arguably the greatest environmentalist president overall, because at the turn of the last century, Theodore Roosevelt obviously did a lot setting up the national park system and that kind of thing. Jimmy Carter doubled the national park system and protected all sorts of wilderness areas and rivers as governor and president. But there was industrial pollution, when Carter was president, not so much before. So if you look at it in terms of the environmental record, 15 major pieces of environmental legislation that were passed and signed when he was president, and Gus can talk about them in detail. But this is an extraordinary record and also unheralded. I mean, I thought I knew something about it, and I was shocked to learn about a lot of this. And the record in Georgia is, I think, without peer. If you look at what he did in Georgia, and we can get into that in more detail. But the legacy of what he did, I think it's time for us to begin to appreciate it. And I also got very interested in where that love of nature came from and how he acted on it in his personal life over the years.
Well, we'll definitely dive into those things. Maybe my next question for you will be about where you think it came from, because I have some views on that as well. But one of the things that my grandfather did when he became president is he reached into this hardcore environmentalist world, and he plucked out this remarkable Rhodes Scholar, Yale educated lawyer to tell him what to do on the environment. And he brought Gus Speth in. And so I'm interested, to know, what your recollection is, how you would sort of sum up the that presidency. As Jonathan mentioned, there's a long list of accomplishments. I don't know if we've had 17 major pieces of environmental legislation in all the time since that presidency. But I would love to know, Gus, just sort of what your initial thoughts are about this, the time you spent with my grandfather in the administration.
Well, thank you, Jason. It's good to be here this night and be here with Jonathan too, whose great book is for sale.
Thank you.
Georgia has so many things to be proud of, but nothing should make Georgia prouder than Jimmy Carter. My goodness. And you can also be very proud of 100 miles too. I was at the founding event not that long ago, and I've seen this group grow from strength to strength. And I'm delighted to be part of one of their programs. I think President Carter was the strongest environmental and conservation president we've had since Teddy Roosevelt. And I think it came from, I think he's the only president since then who's had a deep personal understanding and commitment to environment. We've had a lot of good things done for the environment by various presidents and some terrible things done. But the Carter really had this internally. It was part of his DNA. And I had the experience, delightful experience of working for him in the White House for 4 years. And I remember that he would meet regularly with the environmental leaders of the country. And they were delighted to sit there in the cabinet room and with him. And as was I on the back benches, you know, those guys that are behind there, sort of nodding and trying to look important. And I remember the first meeting. In that meeting, it was all about protecting Alaska lands, and it was put on the docket right then. And Carter understood it, and he knew this was something that he could work on. His Secretary of the Interior, Cecil Andrus, did a lot of the legwork on it too, but Carter was deeply committed to it. It took almost the whole administration to get it done. But when it was over, this is a magnificent conservation achievement in our history. And but he went on, as Jonathan was indicating, to do other things. This whole program that we've had to protect the country from abandoned waste sites and toxic chemicals that have been left all over the landscape, thousands of places. He created the program to deal with that. A lot of land use initiatives, these water projects, these mega projects, the huge boondoggles scattered across the landscape. He tackled them like nobody had ever done before, made him immensely unpopular in certain districts, but he did it. And what's often forgotten now is that he also, there was a movement at that time in the atomic energy area to move to plutonium fuel. And plutonium is a pretty dangerous chemical, and weapons material, and also toxic. And he went after that in a major way. Took a lot of the energy in the administration. But the biggest thing he did, and I'll come back to this because I don't want to rattle on too long here, was his reshaping of national energy policy. And for the first time, proclaiming that climate destruction was a grave threat to the country and needed to be addressed. And as I'll point out later, in the coming decade, he said, which would have been the 1990s.
80s,
so
yeah.
We knew a long time ago that we had a climate problem on our hands. If we'd done what he advocated and continued the programs that he put in place on renewables and efficiency, we'd have had a smooth course to a really effective climate policy. And instead, we didn't take his lead. And we had someone else come in who took the solar panels off the White House, figuratively and literally.
Well, so that sets a really good agenda for this panel. I think what I'd like to do is sort of start, with sort of some of the personal experiences in my grandfather's life, and let Jonathan fill in some of that, and then go through some of those different topics: water, nuclear issues, just regular sort of focus on climate change as a real crisis. And then Gus sort of concluded with both of you guys talking maybe about, not what could have been necessarily, but sort of the lessons learned there about how we didn't, the path not taken. And as I know, Gus has got a book coming out that's going to be called They Knew. And it's about how we knew, to your point, at the time, that this environmental crisis was coming, and we took the wrong path in many, many ways. And so I think we can cover that today, and then we'll answer whatever questions folks have, and I'll chime in from time to time when with some little bits of my grandfather's life that I know maybe that other people don't. But Jonathan, why don't you? I believe in my heart that you mentioned this personal, and Gus, both of you guys mentioned this personal connection to the land and to the places where he grew up, and the rivers and the fields that he grew up in and felt that real connection to as one of the sources for his environmental stewardship and his beliefs there. And I think his faith and other things contributed to that. But Jonathan, if you want to talk a little bit about what you see in his background with respect to that environmental piece, and then if you just do a brief bit about his experience with nuclear catastrophe.
Yeah,
that would be pretty interesting too.
Yeah. I think people wrongly believe that Jimmy Carter was raised in Plains, Georgia. He was born in Plains, He was actually the first president ever born in a hospital. They had a small, very well-regarded hospital in Plains at that time. But he was raised in Archery, which is a few miles outside town on a.
It's a suburb. It's a suburb of Plains, John.
To call it a suburb, I mean, I advise people to go check it out. That's where his boyhood home is, which was built from a Sears Roebuck catalog. And his greatest ambition when he was a kid was to be a farmer. Yeah. And he wanted it partly to please his father, but he fell in love with farming. And as a really young kid, he was learning everything about how to farm. And farming can be pretty complicated, but he developed this love for it and love for the land. And that was, I think, inculcated some by his father, who had been a merchant, who decided he wanted to be a farmer, a very well-to-do by local standards of the time, not necessarily by today's standards. They had no running water, no electricity, no mechanized farm equipment. They might as well have been living in the 19th century, or as President Carter would sometimes say, living at the time of Christ, because they were farming the way they did 2,000 years earlier, basically. But Carter, there was another person involved here who was very important. Carter essentially had three parents. His father, who was a strict disciplinarian, a white supremacist, although not, not a Klansman, but part of the culture of the time. A mother who was very enlightened on race, but gone a lot. She was a nurse and helped introduce him to the idea of global health, which has become so important, especially in his post-presidency. But she wasn't around that much because she was nursing Black patients for free. The wife of the foreman on his property, a woman named Rachel Clark, who signed her name with an X, really became a third parent to him. And he thought of her as an African queen, as he described it. And she would take him fishing, and she would talk to him about God and nature. And she would tell him that we are put here by God to be custodians of the earth, stewards of the earth. And she taught him all about the flora and fauna, but also to love nature. And he never lost that love. And he has many outdoor recreational skills, as you know, Jason, yes. And yes. At a pretty high level on many of them, and spends as much time outdoors as he can. So it was very personal. And he became governor right as the environmental movement was cresting. 1970, that was the year of Earth Day, right? Nationally. Yeah. But he was determined to do a lot as governor. And I can get into the specifics. I mean, the Barrier Islands was a particular focus of his, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, we'll dive into that. I appreciate that background, because I do think you captured it well in the book, but I also think it's real for him, and not just the way I think of the way he thinks of nature. It's not just a love of the land or a love of farming. It's an understanding of the interconnectedness, right. And that understanding of that interconnectedness and why it is that you can do the things he loves to do. I mean, I'll say this: the fall that he had that generated his sort of current condition. He was going turkey hunting. And so, he was 94 years old. But part of it, he wasn't really going out there to hunt turkeys anymore. He was going out there to sit in the woods. And that's where he really feels at home and understands well what that is. And I think that for him, it's a personal sort of ethic. And I'm interested, Gus, and I'll get back to the nuclear fallout story that we didn't get to. Jonathan, no, it's fine, because it's a remarkable story. It's in the book about how he was actually present and participated in a cleanup that, in retrospect, was incredibly dangerous.
Yeah.
And so
Well, if you want, I'll tell the very short version of it.
tell a short version,
Yeah.
because it's amazing.
So in 1952, he was working for Admiral Hyman Rickover on what was the most exciting technological project of the middle of the 20th century, which was putting a nuclear power plant on a submarine. And at this time, they didn't even have them generating electricity yet. They did the submarine first. But there was an experimental nuclear reactor in Chalk River, Canada, secret, highly secret, and it melted down. And this was the first disaster of the nuclear age. And Rickover, a call went out for any qualified personnel to come. And so Rickover sent Carter with a team, and they could only go into the containment facility for 90 seconds. And so they mocked up a model of it on a tennis court nearby, and they knew exactly what they could do, which valves they had to turn, and the other things to stop the flooding of the radioactive water.
To get in and out in 90 seconds.
Get in and out, and he got out in 89 seconds. He always likes to be prompt, you know. At the time, they really had no idea. I mean, the rad exposure that they predicted, they greatly under predicted how exposed he was. I mean, he's still alive, so it obviously, didn't do permanent damage, but he had tremendous amount of exposure just in those 89 seconds.
But I mean, Gus, tell me how, this background and the personal side of this for him. One of the first things you said when you kicked this off this evening was about how, his personal experience and his personal connection and commitment was evident when he was the president. Talk a little bit about that. And if you want to get into some of the other things you mentioned, feel free.
Well, thank you. One story I want to tell is that we had by February 1980, we'd had a decade of environment. So we had this, Carter convened this wonderful, huge meeting in the White House for the second environmental decade celebration. Mm-hmm. And all the environmental leaders from around the country were there, and a big group. And he took the podium and said that he had just met with me and how important this discussion that we'd had was. Well, needless to say, I didn't expect that, and I kind of fell out of my chair, but it gives you a sense of his generosity. And we had talked about a lot of things, and it was, anyhow, I was blown away. But he went on to say at that time that we had to make the climate issue one of the 8 priorities for the coming decade. And that was the first time a president had elevated climate to a national priority. Earlier, he had fought for and got the National Energy Act of '78, which had made energy efficiency the cornerstone of policy. In '79, he set a 20% renewable energy goal by 2000 for the United States. And by the time the administration was over, we had released 4 reports calling for action on climate. So this was a remarkable record, and it's an example of the kind of leadership that we still need. Jimmy Carter believed in the science. He was, in effect, a scientist, an engineer. He believed in facts. Facts are so important. He believed in government and the efficacy of government action and the government's ability to do good for people and the environment. Looking back, I can just say that we knew 40 years ago enough to get serious about climate, even to set a prudent upper bound of the buildup of these greenhouse gases. And we didn't follow the lead that Carter had laid out. So if the one big lesson is to be careful who you elect as president.
I think we know that by now, Gus.
We figured that out one way or the other.
And we got Mr. Reagan, who was a fine fellow in many ways, but he couldn't have cared less about any of these things. And his constituents, his supporters, his staff was quite hostile to a lot of it. So I think there's a lot to be learned from Jimmy Carter about leadership, I think, lessons that would help us today. He was extremely competent. And competence, you know, he knew more than the people who worked for him about almost everything. He had a lot of confidence, which is essential. He was deeply committed to doing the job of president and doing it well. And we know that's not always the case. And he was courageous. He took on the big issues and knew that it was going to cost him politically. I mean, if only some of our politicians today would take on big issues that they knew were going to cost them politically. Yeah. So that's a model for leadership that we need today.
You know, I appreciate that, Gus. I'm gonna change it up a tiny bit and ask you this question. Number one, you just ran through a few sets of things, right? In 1970, my grandfather stood up as the newly elected governor of Georgia and said the time for racial discrimination is over. He said we need to spend time on the environment and make it a priority for the next decade. He put a lot of things front and center that if you repeated them today, they would still be valid and they would still be you know, things we need to prioritize. And frankly, on some level, it's indicative of how little things have changed. You know, it's not how far we've come, it's really how far we haven't come on a lot of those issues. And I have two questions. You know, he just mentioned leadership style, Jonathan. You know, one question that I have, I mean, one potential criticism of my grandfather by a number of people is, you know, he almost refused sometimes to do something that was politically expedient in order to get reelected president. But there were other times in his life where he did things because they were politically expedient and recognized that he needed to go get elected in order to get power. And we have a struggle, you know, in this country and within every political party and the way we talk about politics. Sometimes it's about, you know, what does it take to get elected? And to the points you guys have already made, you know, it does matter who gets elected, but how far are you willing to go to make sure you get reelected in order to preserve your environmental record or whatever? You're not willing to sacrifice some of these other things. I would be interested, Jonathan, in just a quick, you know, comment from you about sort of where you think, given the actual facts, he falls on that spectrum, right? There were clearly times in his life where he did things that he didn't think were right in order to get elected. And then there were other times where he almost stubbornly refused to do some of the things that might have helped him get reelected. How have you reconciled that in your sort of synopsis of him? And I'm not even sure my opinion on that, but we'll come back later.
So I think of him as a political failure. He didn't get reelected. He got swamped by events in the second half of his presidency in 1979 and 80. Political failure, but a substantive and often far-sighted success. He got a lot more, much more done than people realize when they use this kind of lazy shorthand, you know, bad president, great former president. They just haven't looked at the record, if you think about it that way. I understand why people do, because these narratives develop, but you know, I think his mistake was that he didn't align politics with the policy making. So your grandmother, Rosalind Carter, was much more politically shrewd than Jimmy Carter, as both of them recognize.
And everybody else, by the way.
Yeah. And she kept saying, like, can't you wait for the second term to do this? And he thought, if I do the right thing, the people will notice and I'll get reelected. That was a little bit naive on his part. And, you know, you have to attach political calculations to anything. You have to be a good politician to be a reelected president, not to be a good president, because he was a good president without being an especially good politician, but to get reelected, you have to be a good politician. And he didn't even think of himself as a politician. And it raises really interesting questions about what is leadership. So, you know, journalists tend to look at leadership success on the basis of how popular somebody is. So their political success is what determines whether they're a leader. And on that score, you know, Carter doesn't measure up that well. Sometimes he'd charge up a hill, look behind him, there was nobody there, right? But if you think that a leader is taking people where they're not yet sure they need to go and looking over the horizon, then in many ways he was a great leader because of his farsighted qualities. And just something very briefly on his time as governor of Georgia. So you mentioned, that sometimes he would do things to get reelected. The worst example of that was that 1970 campaign when he actually ran a dog whistle campaign. He needed the rural vote. Very few blacks voted in those days. And he was running against Carl Sanders, a popular former governor. And he pandered to that rural white vote. And he didn't say anything racist, but he sort of threw up some dog whistles, And when I asked him about it, he said, look, I had a choice. I could either attack segregation or I could become governor of Georgia. And he decided to do the latter. And then immediately when he came in, and by the way, during the campaign, Vernon Jordan, who died last night.
Oh, no.
He told me that he was for Carter's opponent. And he said Carter whispered to him in that 1970 election, watch what I do, not what I say. And indeed, when he became governor, within 30 seconds of taking the oath, he said the time for racial discrimination is over. Many whites felt betrayed. Black Georgians said, looked at each other and said, he said what? They couldn't believe it. And he became, he integrated Georgia state government. He hung Martin Luther King's portrait in the state capitol. And he embarked on a very ambitious environmental program, and as well as many, many other things. And he knew that he couldn't run for re-election under the Georgia Constitution at that time. So that freed him to do what he thought was right. He said to me at one point that if he had been able to run for re-election, he almost certainly would have lost because he was doing things that were necessary to do, like protecting rivers and wilderness areas that would cost him with contributors in the Georgia establishment that he would need to get reelected, and a lot of other things that just ticked off other interest groups and voters. So he drew this distinction between what you do in campaigns and what you do in office, and unfortunately, that can be fatal politically.
Hey guys, it's Megan. It looks like we lost Jason. I'm going to come back in and take over for him.
Well, we can just keep going, and maybe Gus, you were starting to talk about climate change, and I just wanted to note that in the files at the Carter Library in Atlanta, I found articles from the journal Nature that Carter had underlined in 1971, articles about climate change, when the debate really was within the scientific community. And so he was starting to follow this when almost nobody knew about it as an issue. And, people used to say like, well, why does he get so bogged down in detail? The detail actually was critical to many of his great achievements, from the Alaska Lands Bill, where his mastery of the details was central to the Panama Canal treaties. Camp David never would have happened, and we never would have had peace between Israel and Egypt without that attention to detail. And the same thing went with science and the environment. So, other politicians like to play golf. He liked to read scientific journals, but Gus, you saw some of that knowledge of the details up close, right?
But he knew more about what was going on in my agency than I think I did. And the story was current in the administration that he knew everything about the budget, which is a big, complicated thing. And we've sometimes said to micromanage or be too involved in things that could have been delegated. And that's probably true of a lot of people. And might have been true of him to some degree, but that mastery was important to his leadership, I think.
Can I tell a quick story about that?
And I'm back, by the way. I don't know if you can hear me, Jonathan. I made it back here. So.
Oh, good. Okay, great. Yeah, I can see now. In 1980, when Alaska lands finally came up, and remember, this protected 105 million acres in Alaska. It doubled the size of the national park system, and people just focus on the Arctic Wildlife Refuge, which was the one continually contested part of it, but that was, I think, less than 5%. In any event, Senator Ted Stevens comes to his office, and he is going to try to tell Carter, look, if you draw the map the way I suggest, you take my proposal, I'll vote for this bill, and then it would go through. So he arrives there, and Carter is has the maps on the floor, and then he brings them up to a table, and these very detailed maps of Alaska. And he says, Senator Stevens, like, you want to exempt this area, and these are headwaters for this, and you want to exempt this other area, and these are spawning grounds for that, and in the car, and so I can't accept your map, I'm sorry. And in the car on the way back, Stevens said to an aide, damn it, that guy knows more about my state than I do, and that was that attention to detail that really paid off for the United States and the world on that bill and many others.
Let me ask you guys both this, if it's okay. I hope you can hear me, and I apologize for the world being as it is and me not being able to use my computer apparently. But we, a lot of this stuff was unpopular, right? And the particularly some of these rivers and dam projects, but also some of the other stuff. I mean, we talk about being a political, not doing enough to get reelected, but at the same time, there was some very difficult legislation that actually got passed, Panama Canal Treaty, and some of this environmental stuff. What there was real resistance out there. I know, he talks a lot about dams and things like that. Jonathan, I'm sure he told you those stories as well. But let's talk a little bit about how he overcame some of that political resistance and sort of the vehemence of that resistance. And Gus, maybe you want to start, and then Jonathan can tell us some stories about the dam.
Well, I think the energy proposals were sort of front and center throughout the whole administration, and anytime you try to shift dramatically U.S. energy policy, and you're talking about changing the situation facing huge industries, but he did it, and he did it courageously. We had just developed a huge addiction to imported oil, and he addressed that. I think the thing that we worried about as environmentalists was something that he launched mid-course in the administration, which was called this massive synthetic fuels program. And he promoted a synthetic fuels program to further free us from international oil, but it would have involved what we're now experiencing with fracking and tar sands and other things. So it wasn't well received, but he was courageous about it. I'll give him that, and he pursued it over his friends, many in the environmental community, cautioning against it. But I think to go back, the crowning achievement, in my judgment, it was to see that this climate issue had to be addressed, and to see it, and work on it, and commit his next administration to it, really, in 1980.
So there were so many things that didn't get recognized at all. Like, he introduced fuel economy standards. I mean, we just take those completely for granted. He introduced labeling for, it used to be you You didn't have to label the toxic contents of industrial chemicals. You didn't have to, you didn't have to tell people what was in them. There was no disclosure legislation.
It's almost like the first modern environmental standards at all.
Yeah.
Well, they started, I mean, in fairness to President Ford, so Nixon had created the EPA, and then under pressure from the Democratic Congress, I should add, because Nixon wasn't an environmentalist himself. And then Ford, was pretty environmentally aware, but he didn't really press it. And it wasn't until Carter, the Carter administration, we got these important Clean Water Act and Clean Air Act amendments, which strengthened the EPA. And then there was also, there were things, as Gus said, in the energy area that just kind of blew my mind. Like, I was talking to a very well-informed reporter, one of the good ones, who often paid attention to policy, unlike many of the others. And I said, are you familiar with PURPA? And he said, I can't remember that. What was that? And I said, it was the Public Utility Regulatory Act. It was the first legislation that allowed public utilities to use clean energy, green energy. So he was an all of the above, on the environment, on energy policy. So, he was pro coal because, the main objective was energy independence. And he was pro nuclear only uranium reactors and lost the state of Tennessee for all time by, canceling the Clinch River breeder reactor. And, I'd argue that, synfuels was kind of an expensive mistake, but on many of these other things, it basically allowed energy to transit. Barack Obama told me put it really well. So I didn't get my interview with him until after the hardcover was already done. So it's only in the paperback and in the audiobook. But, when I finally got him on the phone last summer to talk about President Carter, one of the things he said is he took clean energy from the counterculture into the mainstream. And that was a landmark accomplishment. This was something, the kind of thing that before Carter, that you just read about in the Whole Earth Catalog or something like that, and this tremendously changed the way mainstream opinion, at least mainstream opinion, left of center and in the center, and a little bit with some enlightened Republicans, it changed the mindset profoundly.
Well, let me ask this before I got cut off and ended up on my phone in my dining room, and I apologize. The Q&A that was coming in was mostly about the future, and it was sort of two versions of this question. And I'm going to start with Gus, if it's okay. And the question was, how, given the rollbacks that occurred almost immediately after this administration, and given, sort of what has happened since then, continue to keep pushing forward in light of all of that sort of regression that occurred thereafter. And then Jonathan, Mike, the question that's going to be for you is, what do you think has continued to push my grandfather to be so optimistic and idealistic in attacking these issues, even sort of despite some of the setbacks that we're discussing now, in particular, sort of the future of the environmental movement? Gus, do you want to talk about how you keep going?
Well, with difficulty sometimes, but I think it's we can't give up on this fight. As someone said, it's things are much too bad for pessimism. And our children's future, and now my grandchildren's future, is very much at stake here, and we're going to reap a terrible burden of climate disruption willy-nilly at this point, but we could head off unmitigated constant disaster on the planet, and that's really what we're fighting for, and that's a world we do not want to consign our children and grandchildren to. And if we acted as Carter paved the way for, we wouldn't be facing the bad situation we now have before us. So I just think it's we can't give up on these, and sooner or later we're going to win. And I think that I just hope and pray that that's true of a whole range of issues dealing with inequity and deprivation in our society across a broad front. And it's there's so much that we still need to work on and to accomplish, and it's a privilege to have an opportunity to do that, both in our individual lives and through various organizations and institutions.
So in answer to your question, Jason.
Let me introduce it to you, Jonathan, if you don't mind, because I have a view on this too. One way that I describe this, my grandparents, when I'm talking about why they do what they do now, is that my great grandmother, turned 70 in the Peace Corps. And I always say, that she was standing there, he was 50 something years old when he got out of the White House. And she said, I turned 70 in the Peace Corps. What are you going to do? And I do think he had this belief that every day of his life, he was supposed to do the most that he could. But I'm interested to hear you talk about it in particular, and how he maintained that idealism in your view, sort of from the outside.
So I think that he understands that you need to be skeptical and tough-minded, but also optimistic. And part of it is that politicians are generally an optimistic lot, because they wouldn't believe that if they weren't optimistic, they wouldn't believe that government can make a difference in people's lives. And that was validated for him over and over again. I think contributed to his optimism. So just to tell a quick story about Georgia. So he's fishing off of Little Cumberland Island when he's governor, and a sheriff's deputy who kind of moonlighted as caretaker tries to arrest him for trespassing. And he wasn't happy about it. And, the guy he was fishing with told him, told the sheriff's deputy this is the governor, and the guy finally backed up. And when he gets back to Atlanta, he gets legislation passed and signed that opens every navigable river in the state of Georgia to the public. Now, before that, you couldn't go a lot of places. And then, or take the Chattahoochee, like he went down there in a canoe and learned how to, Georgia State learned how to roll in the canoe and, developed in a kayak, and developed a real love for that river. And at that time, developers wanted to build high rises literally right up at the riverbank. Can you imagine what the Chattahoochee would look like now if you had high rises right up at the riverbank? And so he worked out a deal in the same way that he worked out a deal to save Cumberland Island with the federal government and the various competing interests at the state level for these easements, so that, it's a few thousand feet, I don't know exactly, I think 2,000 feet back before there can be, so the riverbanks are there for all of our enjoyment. And those are just two of literally hundreds of things that he accomplished in government. And so I think, to the question of why people should be inspired to get involved and what people can do, the answer is politics. Some agitation, and movement building. But if you elect the right people, things can change. And if you look at the difference between what Georgia voters did in January and basically, I hate not to put too fine a point on it, but at the time Carter became governor, Georgia was mostly electing white terrorists, people who were fine with terrorism in their community against Black people, So to say, yeah, you're right, Jason, at the beginning, you said, there's a lot of, in some ways, we haven't come very far. And that's completely true. But in other ways, we've come a long way. And that should inspire us to believe that we can go even further and confront some of these challenges.
That's a very good point, and I think that's totally fair. One of the other questions was expressly a question about inspiration, and the question asks, you know, how has he inspired us? And I'll take that one if it's okay, and maybe almost give everybody a little bit of a closing argument afterwards. But by the way, in addition to having moved to my telephone to conduct the rest of this, I just got a notice that I only have 10% power left. So if I lose power, I'm on mute. We'll just know that it's 2021 and it's just like 2020. But we have, for me, you know, I used to joke about how sort of presidents are people too. And I knew it because I knew one so well, you know, and he still, every once in a while, even, you know, a couple weeks ago, he called me, and it pops up on my phone and it says Papa on mobile, and I answered it and I said hello, and he said, who's this? And I said, it's Jason. He said, what do you want? I said, you called me. He said, no, I'm trying to take a picture. And I was like, well, all right, fine. Like, you may be a nuclear engineer, you may have done all this stuff, you may know the ins and outs of every policy that Gus was ever working on, but you still, like everybody else, can't use your phone. I think having that belief and that understanding, you know, and knowing that what you're talking about, when you talk about someone who doubled the size of the national parks, who preserved the entire Chattooga River, who put the Chattahoochee National protection in place, who did all of this enormous stuff, it was just a single human life, you know? And yes, he's remarkable in all these ways, but the way that he approaches it, and even the way we approach it at the Carter Center, is based on this idea that I think he has in his heart, which is nobody's really better than anybody else. Everybody has this potential, if given the tools and the opportunities, to do great things. And I think the way it manifests itself in the work of the Carter Center, just to give an example, is, you know, guinea worm disease has been eradicated, or will be eradicated in the next couple of years, as the second human disease ever eradicated. And it's not like smallpox or polio, which has a vaccine. It's eradicated only by breaking the transmission. And in order to do that, you have to change the way that people in tiny villages in Africa get their water. And you know, people have been getting their water, to Jonathan's earlier point, the same way for 20,000 years, literally, million years maybe. And to go into a community of 600 people in the middle of nowhere in Mali, and to see not a place where you send pity, but a place where, hey, he thinks, I know people who live in a 600-person village in the middle of nowhere, in Plains or in Archery, even smaller. And I know that the people in that community have the power to change their own life, their own community, their own world. And when the Carter Center walked into those places and saw the power that people had in those communities and believed in it and invested in it. And now in the last 20 years, we'll have taken guinea worm disease from over 3.5 million cases to last year, less than 20. And it's not that the Carter Center did it, it's that we understood and believed, because of my grandparents, that an individual person, no matter where they come from, no matter what they look like, they can make a difference in their community. And to me, you know, yes, we talk about these grand sweeping achievements that he had, and they're real, but I think the way he looks at them, and certainly the way I look at them, is this is what can happen when a person with the right opportunities and the right abilities devotes themselves to it. And I've never, you know, I think that, you know, he has surrounded himself with remarkable people, with remarkable educations, with remarkable resumes, but he's also, to your point earlier, Jonathan, surrounded himself with people who are just competent, good humans, and respected their ability to change the world. And I think it's a remarkable legacy for us. Certainly that's the way we look at it at the Carter Center. And some of those health programs and the way that we confront these problems, but that gives you hope that people are going to get together and do the right thing. And to your point, if you know, it underscores his belief in human rights, which is about the fact that if you give people the opportunities and the room to live their life, they will take it and do good with it. it undergirds this idea of environmental protection, that we all have our own job to do. And that interconnectedness that we discussed earlier. But anyway, that's my answer to that question about inspiration. And I'm happy to let you guys give sort of a closing argument, and then we'll wrap up. But I just want to say thanks to both of you, because just from my perspective, and I know from my grandparents' perspective as well, people always ask, do you think history will be kind to Jimmy Carter? And I say I don't want history to be kind. I just want it to be honest and truthful about what he was like and what he did. And so for that, Jonathan, I appreciate it. And Gus, to have someone of your stature in this environmental movement talk well about his role in it, it's just meaningful to me from a legacy standpoint. So thank you for that. And we'll let Gus go, and then Jonathan, and then we'll say thanks.
Well, Jason, you touched on something that I really wanted to close with. I think a mark of a good leader, a strong leader, is picking people. The bigger the job, the more you have to delegate and rely on people and trust them. And President Carter did that. He was not afraid of appointing powerful, bright, determined people to positions throughout the government. And I think of the regulatory group that he assembled, for example, Joan Claybrook in transportation, Carol Tucker Foreman in agricultural food and safety, Doug Costel at EPA, Eula Bingham in occupational health and safety. I mean, these were people that were heroic, really, in their determination to protect the public, and he supported them all the way. So he not only picked good people, but he knew how to give them the backing that they need to do their jobs. And that is definitely, as you were indicating, Jason, part of a strong leader, good leadership.
Thanks, Gus.
I think that, first of all, your grandfather is an enormously complex figure, and this makes him fascinating, certainly for me in the 5 years I spent on the book, and I hope for readers. And I think that his example, beyond what is sometimes thought of as the Methodist tradition. Rosalind Carter grew up in the Methodist Church of, do as much as you can for as many as you can for as long as you can. But in addition to that, there is a willingness to let different parts of your personality and your drive and determination come out in different ways. So on his 50th birthday, on October 1st, 1974, he assembled the press and he said, "I am canceling the Sprewell Bluffs Dam on the Flint River." It's down near Thomaston. And, this was the congressman from the area didn't even think he had the power to do this, but he figured out how to do it. And, it was the right decision, but it's kicked off a huge fight. So sometimes you have to fight. He understood that. And sometimes you have to work on a longer time horizon for things that you're not going to accomplish in the short term, but be engaged in kind of movement building to light a beacon for the future on something like human rights. And in that sense, he can inspire us in several different dimensions at the same time that are all dimensions of his character. And I think ultimately character is destiny. And I have no doubt whatsoever that Jimmy Carter's core decency and his commitment to do, what I call his very best at everything that he does, never on Miller time, never phoning it in, that these parts of his life can inspire many people. And I've just found on my, virtual book tour that there are a lot of younger people who are really tuning in to Jimmy Carter's legacy. And on the day after the election, Pete Buttigieg had me on his podcast. And I'm thinking, like, come on, this is the day after the election. And I just, first of all, I thought he would cancel, there was a lot to talk about. But, we talked for just a few minutes about the election. And then he wanted to talk about Jimmy Carter. And he had gone down during his campaign to visit Carter, as did Amy Klobuchar and Cory Booker. And they are inspired by him. And I think they represent a lot of younger people who are, they believe that he is an epic American figure who can inspire people for generations to come.
We'll conclude with this. Mayor Pete, who now is secretary, or will soon to be secretary, Pete is one of my grandfather's favorites, and they talk actually a lot, like multiple times a month. So, it's really interesting. They really do like each other, and that intergenerational stuff is remarkable. Thanks to both of you so much. Thanks to 100 Miles for having us, and Megan or whomever. I no longer have any technological capabilities with respect to this Zoom, so someone else is going to have to take it from here. But I have had a great time, and Jonathan, thank you for the book, and Gus, for all that you've done for this movement and all that you've done for the world, and your remarkable accomplishments and resume. We appreciate you both. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Jason.
Thank you.
Well, I want to echo my thanks. This was an amazing conversation, and thank you all for the time you put in. Jason, thank you so much for your persistence and your commitment to making sure that you were present despite the technological issues. We appreciate it. Well, I want to just come back to a couple of things that y'all said, just to kind of wrap it up. You have been referring to a commitment and a belief and actually a quote that President Carter is known for. And the quote actually is, "I have one life and one chance to make it count for something. My faith demands that I do whatever I can, whenever I can, wherever I am, and for as long as I can, with whatever I have, to try and make a difference." And our conversation tonight also reminds me of a quote from last week that Briante McCorkle and Bill McKibben brought up by Maya Angelou that says, "Do your best until you know better. Then when you know better, do better." And y'all said that one of the strengths of President Carter in his commitment to his life and doing the best that he can is that he was skeptical and tough-minded, but also optimistic. And then finally, Jason mentioned that he always remained committed to the idea that everybody has the potential to do great things. And so this kind of reminds me of the environmental movement and the people on this Zoom call. I think we have to remember that our movement and our work is going to have ebbs and flows. We're going to have successes and failures. But what we have to remember is that progress comes one step at a time. And we have made a commitment that requires flexibility and persistence. And imagine what this world would be like if we all had President Carter's perspective, flexibility, and commitment to our world. So I'm going to wrap up tonight, and I want to thank you both for being here. I have a couple of slides to show, and so I'm going to move to that part of this presentation and turn off my camera because I want to thank a few really important people who have been part of these 5 weeks that we've had.
Thank you, Megan.
Thanks, Megan.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much for having us.
My pleasure. As you know, this is the last session of our 5-week series where we work to answer big questions. We say every week that this conference would not be possible without the generosity of our sponsors and our partners, and it's true. Thanks again to all of them for making this year's Choosing to Lead possible. I also want to thank you, our participants and viewers. Your questions and comments have been amazing, and your commitment to this event over the past 5 weeks is nothing short of inspiring and humbling. Thank you for choosing to spend your time with us. And finally, I want to thank our sponsors, Wendy Paulson, Carl Safina, Brian Scarry, Josiah Watts, Drew Lanham, Briante McCorkle, Bill McKibben, Jonathan Alter, Jason Carter, and Gus Speth. We are so fortunate that these unbelievably accomplished people chose to join us and focus on our coast for a few hours each week. Their participation is a testament to their character, generosity, and to their commitment to this planet and the people working to save it. Even though our live events are finished, our speakers have been kind enough to let us share the videos of their sessions with you and others. So if you missed a session or would like to revisit something someone said, or if you would like to share one of the sessions with someone else, we encourage you to visit our website to watch or share the video of your choice. Also on our website, you will see resources that we have put together to support each of the sessions. It is a robust library of articles and videos that will help you dive in and learn more about many of the topics we discussed. It is there for you, so please feel free to explore and share. After this discussion tonight, I can't help but think about my children and future grandchildren. So as we close this year's Choosing to Lead conference, I would like to leave you with a challenge. Let us go away always remembering to give thanks to the ancestors we have. And let's also remember that our children and grandchildren will one day have an opportunity to thank their ancestors, which will include us, for the legacy they inherit. So let us live our lives so that the world they inherit is a better place and one in which they can be proud. Thanks so much for joining us for the Choosing to Lead conference. I hope you have a great night.